some of the most amazing organisms on the planet called parasitoid wasps. I'm excited. I'm nervous a little bit. I've never done a webinar before, but I'm glad that you've all tuned in. We're going to talk about one of the most diverse groups of animals that almost nobody has ever heard of. And along the way, we're also going to talk about some of the amazing stories of chemical warfare, mind control, and extreme evolution that we've seen in these animals. If you want to contact me during the webinar, feel free to type in a question, and I'll get back to those at the end. A big thank you to Elgin High School for putting this on. This is going to be a blast. So if you want to contact me after the webinar, my email and my Twitter handle are down on the bottom right side of your screen, and I also have a YouTube channel, some of those videos you'll be seeing today. So let's get started. Who am I? I am currently a graduate student. I'm working on my PhD at the University of Minnesota, and I study in the Monarch Lab. So we study monarch butterflies and all aspects of their biology. One thing that I study in addition to monarchs is these little insects called parasitoids that attack butterflies, monarchs and other butterflies as well. So I've mentioned this word parasitoid several times. What is a parasitoid exactly? Well, it's certainly not a predator. On your screen right now you see an owl that's killed a duck. Predators consume other organisms, oftentimes needing many other organisms throughout their lifespan. They're usually larger than their prey items, and they're always lethal. A parasite, on the other hand, is usually smaller than its host. It lives on this host, and it feeds on these organisms. But importantly, it usually does not kill its host. Parasitoids, on the other hand, fall somewhere in between predators and parasites. Like parasites, they live on their hosts and they feed on them. They only need one host throughout their whole life cycle. But like predators, they're always lethal. So most parasitoids are insects, and the vast majority are in the families of wasps and flies. Basically, what a parasitoid does is lay its eggs on or inside of another host. Those eggs then hatch into larvae, just like all insects. They go through egg larval stages. The larvae are feeding on the host from the inside, and then they will pupate and become adults. In this picture on the screen, this is a caterpillar, a tobacco hornworm caterpillar that's been parasitized by a wasp. One female wasp laid many eggs into it, and that group of siblings grew up together inside of this host, and when they were finished feeding, they emerged from the host and spun their cocoons on the outside. So that's what these little Q-tip things look like. These little things that look like Q-tips are actually little tiny wasps inside. Now these parasitoid wasps are not like the typical wasps we think of, the ones that come and drink our soda and sting people. Parasitoids actually don't sting people. They have a different sort of stinger apparatus that they only use on their hosts. And there are many, many species of them, but because they're not attracted to our beverages in the park as much as those larger social wasps are, we often don't see them or don't recognize them as parasitoids. So if this life cycle of a parasitoid sounds kind of odd to you or maybe a little bit familiar, it could be that you've seen one of the movies in the Alien series. So this is a fictional creature. This is not real life, but essentially in these movies, the directors and the writers have taken the idea of parasitoids and applied them to animals from another planet. In this case, the animals. There's been 4 different movies: Alien, Aliens, Alien 3, and Alien Resurrection. There might be another one coming out in the future. The writers and the directors have taken this lifestyle that parasitoids use, insect parasitoids use, and applied it to aliens attacking humans. So a bit of a stretch, but because there are no parasitoids that attack humans or even vertebrates. They all attack other insects and arthropods. But still, the ideas are the same, and I think that's pretty entertaining. So let's go through a few examples just to get an idea of what parasitoids do and how much sort of diversity there is in the parasitoids. So this is a spider. You can see that. We've all seen spiders, but many of us probably haven't seen a spider with a little parasitoid larva attached to it. That's what that white slug-looking thing is. This is an ectoparasitoid, meaning it feeds from the outside of the host. And in this case, the host stays alive while the parasitoid is feeding. There are also endoparasitoids. So this is a little tiny wasp laying an egg into the egg of another type of insect. These are eggs of a larger bug, but this parasitoid is going to lay her eggs into this, and instead of a nymph of a bug emerging, it will be an adult parasitoid emerging. So these are endoparasitoids. And in this case, the host is killed right away. So sometimes the hosts stay alive for a while, sometimes the hosts die. They can be inside or outside. And what I want to do now is show you a video of one of my favorite types of parasitoids. They're absolutely amazing. Here we go. So this is a parasitoid called Megarissa, and it has this enormously long ovipositor. So what you're seeing right now is this female parasitoid on the side of a tree. And what she's doing is setting up her ovipositor so that she can drill through the bark of the tree to get to the host on the other side. There are little grubs feeding on the inside of this tree bark that she's going to push through the bark that she can insert her eggs into that grub. How she finds these grubs is still a question. It could be using vibrations or chemical cues like scents, but we're not really sure. But one amazing thing about this is that these grubs are often crawling at some speed underneath the bark. And as they're crawling, they're moving. So if this female parasitoid attempts to lay her eggs into the larva where it is right now, she might miss it because it will be gone by the time she burrows through. This video is about 16 minutes long, and it takes her about 10 minutes to get all the way into the tree. I'm not going to show you the whole video, of course, but you can see she has this ovipositor like other parasitoids that we talked. But she also has two additional appendages that stay with the ovipositor. So the ovipositor is what she uses to place the eggs, but she also has these two extra that help her burrow through the bark of this tree. And so she has to plan ahead to know where the grub is going to be under the bark. It takes a long time. And eventually she'll get her ovipositor all the way down into the tree and pull it out. And I'm just going to show you the end of her pulling this ovipositor out of the tree, so that you can get a view for just how long this is relative to her body. So if you're ever in the forest and you see one of these parasitoids, you're lucky because they're pretty rare. But also just notice how clumsily they fly. They have a really amazing life cycle. Let's see if we can get to the point where she pulls it out of the tree. She's getting close now. So she's using her legs to clean her ovipositor and those other appendages. And as the cameraman zooms out, you get a sense of just how long those are relative to her whole body. So those are very amazing parasitoids in my opinion. Let's take a look at some others. So this is the honeybee that we're all pretty familiar with. But an organism that you might not be familiar with is this little one right here. This is a fly, just in the same group of insects as house flies that you see in your house, but these are parasitoid flies. And here it's laying an egg or multiple eggs between this little segment of the host. If you want a close-up of the fly, this is what they look like. They're very tiny, very, very tiny. But you can see, again, they have this large appendage called an ovipositor for laying eggs. They also have, a lot of parasitoids have very developed antennae because they use them for finding their hosts. They smell the air and they find their host that way. So after the fly lays her eggs into this bee, after about 10 to 20 days, these little grubs will emerge from the bee. So the bee is alive for most of this time, but it does have noticeable differences in its behavior, essentially because these parasitoids are eating it from the inside. So the way these parasitoids, this species of parasitoid was discovered was that a scientist in California was walking on campus at the university where he worked, and he saw these bees acting strangely on the sidewalk. And he didn't really think much about it, but he had the forethought to put them in a jar and put them on his desk, and he kind of forgot about them. A couple days later, he noticed that the bees were dead, and also that there were other little insects in the container. So he took a closer look and he realized that there were flies that had parasitized these bees and had emerged from them. So that's how this parasitoid was discovered. And probably my favorite thing about this interaction is that these zombies, or these bees, excuse me, that have been attacked by these parasitoids but are still alive are called zombies. And you can get t-shirts with these different logos on them. This is just a Google image search of the word zombie, so you can see I didn't make this up. So this is an example of mind control, where these parasitoids are influencing the behavior of these bees. Normally a bee would go back to its hive at night, or if it's raining, but when they're infected by these parasitoids, they often don't do that. They stay out at night and out of the hive at times when you wouldn't expect them to do that. So they're influencing their behavior, because if these parasitoids emerged when they were inside of the hive, they probably wouldn't have as good of a chance of surviving to parasitize their own hosts. Here's another video of behavioral manipulation. Let me pull it up for you. This is from the National Geographic. So I'm going to play parts of this video, not the whole thing, but feel free to go back and watch it.
Has spent the last 12 days gorging itself. It now appears profoundly obese. But this is not all fat. The glomerata wasp larvae lie just under its skin. Each is the size of a grain of rice, but together they account for over a third of the caterpillar's weight. The larvae have not yet finished growing and need to keep their host alive. So although they feast on the caterpillar's blood, they have been careful not to touch a single one of its vital organs. This uneasy truce will not last. Within days, the larvae are fully matured. Suddenly, they begin to stir into action. For the past 2 weeks, this surrogate womb has protected them, but now they no longer need it. To complete the next stage of their life cycle, they must break out. But as their bodies have grown, they have developed tiny, saw-like teeth. These jagged jaws are for one job only: cutting their way out. Stroke by stroke, the larvae see nothing it can do. free at last, the larvae enter a new phase of development. They swiftly spin silken cocoons. These will provide the perfect environment for their final transformation. But ironically, one of the greatest dangers the larvae will face is being themselves impregnated by other species of parasitic wasp. Incredibly, the wounded caterpillar helps them out. Usually, a caterpillar would spin a silken blanket to make its own cocoon. But the parasitized caterpillar spins his blanket on top of the wasp cocoons, giving them an extra layer of protection. Scientists believe the same wasp virus that infected it weeks before has now invaded the caterpillar's brain and caused this bizarre corruption of its normal behavior. Amazingly, the caterpillar's natural aggression is now also exploited by the wasp virus. The caterpillar becomes a bodyguard, actively protecting the cocoons from other parasites. It will watch over them unceasingly until it eventually starves to death.
So this is an extreme example of behavioral manipulation. The parasitoids have made this host of theirs protect them even after they've eaten it from the inside, which is pretty remarkable. Let's take a look at a couple more examples of these animals that are all around us. This tiny little wasp attacks aphids. Aphids are little insects that suck the juices out of plants. They're often pests for food producers, farmers. And in this case, these wasps lay their egg into small aphids. The aphids survive for a few days. Some of them even have their own offspring after being parasitized. But eventually, that parasitized aphid will turn into what's called a mummy. It's kind of a papery-like casing that resembles an aphid, except it's larger. It's more of a round shape. And the parasitoid completes its development in this mummy and cuts a hole in the back end of it and emerges. So far we've had comparisons to aliens, zombies, and mummies. I hope you're keeping track. I wonder if any of the other webinars have had that combination. Probably not. So I just told you about parasitoids of aphids, and this brown thing in the middle of the picture is an aphid mummy, and this black wasp is a parasitoid that is laying eggs into the mummy. But remember, mummies are already parasitized, so that means that this wasp is a parasitoid of the parasitoid inside. So that another word for that is a hyperparasitoid. So just think about this. Aphids are parasitic on plants. There are parasitoids of aphids, and then there are parasitoids of parasitoids. And in some other examples, there are even parasitoids of parasitoids of parasitoids. So this is getting kind of crazy. This is getting pretty crazy. So one question you might have been wondering is, how do these parasitoids find their hosts anyway? So let's imagine that this tomato plant is a host for this caterpillar, and this wasp on the upper left corner needs to find that caterpillar. How does it work? Well, essentially, when a plant is being eaten by an herbivore, it releases certain chemicals into the air. Those chemicals essentially are acting like a cry for help from the plant. The parasitoids can smell these chemicals using their antennae, and they can follow those chemicals until they find that host. So essentially, the plant is calling out for help. The parasitoid hears that call for help and comes to the rescue and removes that herbivore, that insect, from the plant. So plant chemicals can help parasitoids find their hosts, but they can also hurt parasitoids. So here we have two examples. On the left, we have a tasty plant, one that doesn't have any toxins in it, and the caterpillar that feeds on that plant is tasty too. It doesn't have any toxins either. But if we imagine that this group on the right is a toxic plant, and the caterpillar that feeds on that plant takes those toxins into its own body, this actually happens in many different examples, the caterpillar becomes toxic as well. So if the same parasitoid attacks both of these hosts, then what you might get is faster development and larger offspring out of the tasty caterpillar, and slower development and smaller offspring out of the toxic caterpillar. So plant chemicals can help or hurt parasitoids. One example of a toxic host is the monarch butterfly, one of the organisms that I study. So this is a photo of the monarch butterfly. Maybe some of you recognize it. I've heard about it. Maybe you've even studied it in your own classrooms. And these are the immature, these are the larvae and an egg of this species of butterfly. So monarchs feed on milkweeds. Milkweeds have toxins in them called cardenolides. And these toxins work against most animals. They bind to certain types of cellular machinery, and they gum them up so that they don't work anymore. And in humans and most animals, this causes cardiac arrest, heart failure. But monarchs seem to be pretty much immune to it. You might also notice that both the adults and the larvae are very brightly colored. And a common name for this phenomenon that toxic species or poisonous species are brightly colored, maybe some of you know this word, is aposematic. So if you Google image aposematic, you get a whole bunch of different kinds of animals. We have frogs, amphibians. These are probably poison dart frogs. There's a monarch. We also even have snails, a wasp, a paper wasp, and a snake here. So lots of different aposematic organisms. These are all toxic, and the bright warning coloration tells predators or would-be predators, you probably don't want to eat me, stay away. So the monarch life cycle is very cool to watch, especially the process of metamorphosis. And I have some videos that are from my YouTube channel that I'd like to share with you. So let me pull up one of those. Time lapse. Here we go. So those videos are, this video is a time lapse. I sped it up so that it's easier to watch in a short amount of time. But what you can see is the caterpillar was hanging from the roof of its container in the lab, in this case, and then it's wiggled its way out of its larval skin, and inside we saw this pupa. I'm going to show you another time lapse, this time of the next part of metamorphosis. So this pupa will remain for about 10 days, and then a butterfly would emerge from that. So let's take a look at this video. So that was another time lapse. In this case, you saw the butterfly emerging from its pupal casing or chrysalis. How it does that is it pulls air into its body so that it can expand until it breaks the cracks in the pupal casing and it has enough gap to drop out like you saw there. And then its abdomen was very full of what we call hemolymph, which is just a word for insect blood. And it had to pump all that hemolymph into its wings so that they could expand. And this butterfly will stay hanging like this for a couple of hours while its wings harden and dry before it can fly. So those are examples of what happens when the monarch is not found by these parasitoids, but I'm studying a parasitoid that does not have a common name, but it does have a scientific name, and that scientific name is Pteromalus custodes. There are several little wasps on this caterpillar that's about to pupate, and they're waiting for this caterpillar to shed its skin because they lay their eggs into the pupae. So this is a picture that was taken in the field of a little wasp, Pteromalus custodes wasp, laying her eggs into this pupae. And this is a close-up. So these are about the size of a grain of rice, or even smaller, 2 to 3 millimeters long. And of course I have some videos of these interactions in our lab as well. So let me pull those up. So what you just saw was this little female parasitoid finding this monarch pupa for the first time. You can see the pupa is very fresh, it's still soft, and it can actually move in response to feeling the wasp crawling onto it, but that movement's not enough to get the wasp off of it. After about an hour or so, the monarch pupa will no longer be able to move, but it will be harder and harder. Because it's harder, it's more difficult for the wasp to grab onto and to poke its ovipositor into, but they can still do it. So this wasp would stay in contact with this monarch chrysalis for anywhere from a few hours to a day or two, which is quite a long time. And then instead of a monarch butterfly emerging from this chrysalis, what would likely happen is these parasitoids would emerge. I'm going to show you what that looks like. So there you saw the parasitoids emerging out of that chrysalis, one at a time from one little exit hole. You might have noticed that some of them were crawling on top of each other. Those were the small ones, or males that were attempting to mate with their siblings. This is very common in parasitoids. And I fast forwarded a couple times so that you could see kind of how many came out. I think from that single host, over 120 wasps emerged out of that one chrysalis. So they're very tiny, very numerous. And these are the organisms that I spend most of my days trying to figure out, trying to understand. So we know that these parasitoids can survive in monarchs, but we've also said that monarchs are toxic. This series of photos shows a blue jay that has been reared in captivity. It's never met a monarch butterfly before, but researchers gave it the opportunity to eat a monarch, and it did. You can see that on the left, it caught this monarch and it's eating it. The third picture in, it starts to look like it's not feeling so great. And in the final picture, you see it vomiting this monarch back up. And very interesting thing about this is that blue jays learn to never eat another monarch after they've encountered just one. And so it's clear that monarchs taste bad and are toxic to a lot of animals. We don't necessarily know if they're toxic to some of their insect natural enemies, like this one, Pteromalus cassotus. So that's what I set out to learn. To do this, I reared monarchs on two different types of milkweeds, two different species of milkweeds. And the milkweeds vary in their toxicity. So each of these dots represents a type of milkweed and how toxic the butterflies that are reared on that milkweed are. And what you can see is there's a general pattern where the more toxic the plant is, the more toxic the butterfly is. So I chose one plant that was very high in toxicity, a Curasavica on the top right, and one plant that was very low in toxicity, a Incarnata on the bottom left. And I reared caterpillars on these two, knowing that they would sequester different amounts of toxins. The ones that were reared on the toxic plants would be more toxic than the ones reared on the less toxic plants. And then I took those pupae that had been fed as caterpillars and I exposed them to these parasitoids. I essentially put one pupa in a container with one parasitoid and I left them for 3 days. And then I took the parasitoid out and I saw what happened. And so this bar graph shows what the results were. The toxic plant is on the right and the less toxic plant is on the left. And then within each of these bars, you can see that some of the trials resulted in wasps being successful, some of the trials resulted in butterflies being successful, and then other things in between. So the blue parts of the bars represent the proportion of the trials that ended up producing a butterfly, a healthy adult butterfly. The red portions of the bars represent the proportion of the trials where wasps were successful and emerged. And then the yellow and the green portions are sort of in between. The yellow represents cases where the host was parasitized and we dissect it and find dead parasitoids inside, but none of them emerged. And then the green bars represent cases where the host died, but we couldn't know for sure if it was because they were parasitized or they just died for some other reason. When we dissected them, we couldn't find parasitoids inside. So the main finding from this figure is that they really aren't very different depending on which plant they fed on. The ones that fed on less toxic plants were a little bit less likely to be butterflies and a little bit more likely to turn into wasps than the ones that fed on more toxic plants. But these, based on how many trials we did, we used 105 caterpillars fed on the low toxic and 110 fed on the high toxic plants. Based on those numbers, we can't for sure say that the plant toxins made a difference for the parasitoid success. I found this kind of surprising because I've always known that monarchs are toxic. And so I tested several other things too. I counted the number of wasps that emerged from each of these types of hosts, and they weren't significantly different. I also looked at the proportion of wasps that died inside of hosts, and they weren't significantly different. I even looked at how long the wasps survive as adults after they've emerged from these hosts, and even that wasn't different. So I'm convinced now that there might be a very small effect of these toxins, but it's really pretty negligible. It's not a big deal to these parasitoid wasps, which type of plant the caterpillar fed on. And this got me thinking about other ways that insects defend themselves against parasitoids, especially if this chemical warfare does not work. So how do hosts defend themselves? Well, this is a picture of a monarch chrysalis found in the wild. And I'm amazed that this was found at all because you can see it's very well camouflaged. It's the same color as the leaves. The sun reflecting off the leaves kind of looks like this gold ridge. And you can imagine that a good way to get away from parasitoids is to hide. Simply hope they don't find you. Another way that insects might defend themselves, this is a very interesting example of a case where a mother has to throw away some of her offspring to save the others. So this is a cluster of eggs from a moth. The moth lays her eggs in this hexagonal pattern, and the very cool thing about this pattern is that it minimizes the number of eggs on the outside of the shape, and it maximizes the number of eggs on the inside of the shape. Now, why would she do that? The answer is because here you're seeing the moth larvae crawling out of this cluster of eggs, and only the larvae from the inner eggs hatched. All of the eggs that are on the outer side of this cluster actually were parasitized, and this is very common, were parasitized by wasps. So essentially, these larvae will emerge and crawl away. A few days later, all of these exterior eggs will produce adult parasitic wasps that will fly away. So essentially what the mother is doing is using as few of her offspring as possible to protect the rest of her offspring by packing them in this pattern, which is just amazing to me. Another way that's really cool that hosts defend themselves from parasitoids is by recruiting bodyguards. So this is an ant, and this is a caterpillar, and the ant and the caterpillar are actually getting along. The ant is protecting this caterpillar from anything that might eat it, parasitoids or other predators. And the ant in return is getting a little bit of food. These caterpillars produce a sugary substance called honeydew that these ants then feed on. So this is called a mutualism, where both species are benefiting by interacting with another. So these are a few ways that insects protect themselves from parasitoids. I also wanted to mention, since this is a webinar on biodiversity, just to talk about the number of species on Earth. This is a pie chart that shows relative numbers of species of each type of animal. You can see that the biggest chunk of the pie by far are insects. Another very thin slice is the chordates, and there's a picture of a frog near it. It's kind of on the upper left. Chordates include all the amphibians and fish and mammals and birds. And you can see it's just a tiny slice of the biodiversity on life. Fungi have a lot of biodiversity. Arachnids, which are kind of closely related to insects, things like spiders and scorpions have a lot of diversity. But insects by far have the most. It's also important to note that within the insects there are some very species-rich groups. One of these is the beetles. You see a beetle pictured there. The other is the ants, the bees, and the wasps, which are all relatives. And the parasitoid wasps fit into that group. So biologists like to group things by relatedness. And in the case of parasitoids, they're grouped into superfamilies. There are 11 large superfamilies, and the largest of these has 80,000 species estimated. They haven't all been described yet, but it's been estimated that there are 80,000 species. By contrast, all of the vertebrates, including humans, fish, amphibians, birds, reptiles, all of those only have 64,000 species. So in this one group of parasitoids, there are more species than all of the vertebrates combined. Plus, there are 10 other superfamilies that aren't as large but are still quite large compared to the vertebrate species groups. So why are there so many species of parasitoid? Well, one reason that scientists think this is true is because they're very host specific. Most parasitoids will only attack one or a few species of hosts. Sometimes they will attack more than that, but typically most are very species specific. So if every parasitoid only attacks one host, you can have lots and lots of parasitoids because there are lots and lots of hosts, like butterflies. Another reason, or another thing that has upped this estimate is something called cryptic diversity. So we used to think that you could go out and catch insects and look at them and tell if they are the same species or a different species. But now that scientists have better genetic capabilities for testing the genes of these species, as well as better host records, knowing which hosts they attack and which ones they don't, we've actually figured out that there's a lot of what's called cryptic diversity. So these groups of parasitoids that look very similar, we think they were one species attacking several different hosts, but when we sequence their genes and look at which hosts they're attacking, we actually learn that there are several cryptic species that look alike but are different and don't mate and attack different hosts. So one final thing I want to mention about parasitoid diversity is that it's potentially at risk because if a host goes extinct, then that parasitoid is also very likely to go extinct unless it finds another host very quickly in evolutionary time. And in the current state of affairs, we're in what's called the sixth mass extinction of the globe. The species that are most at risk are those that are specialists, like parasitoids and other parasites. So we're estimating that parasitoids and other parasites are going to be hit harder by this mass extinction than more generalist species, things that eat a lot of different things. Another really cool application of parasitoids in our life is that they're important for regulating ecosystems, even ecosystems like farms. So this picture is a vegetable farm. Imagine that you're a farmer here and everything's going well until one day some butterflies come and lay a bunch of eggs. And those eggs turn into caterpillars and start eating your crop. This is bad news if you want to sell your crop or eat it yourself because they start to decimate your crop population. So what can be done is called biological control. Essentially, you can release parasitoids that will attack this pest species, and the idea is that they will control the population of this pest species and limit the amount of damage that is done to your crops. So there might still be some damage, but the parasitoids that you release will keep those pest populations in check. That's the idea. It works well sometimes, other times it hasn't worked so well. We're still trying to figure out what makes a successful biological control. But one main reason that this applies beyond agriculture is that some people think that the world, when you look outside, is mostly green. Most plants are still alive and well because there are these parasitoids and predators keeping populations of caterpillars and other herbivores in check. So parasitoids are probably very important for how ecosystems function and the food that makes it to our table. So I want to wrap up with time for questions and just conclude with a few reminders of what we've talked about today. So you can see that there's extreme diversity of parasitoid wasps, many species. Many are very host specific. That's in the top left picture. The top right picture is an example of this mind control that parasitoids can do to their hosts. They keep their hosts alive in order to protect them from other parasitoids and things like that. The bottom left picture represents plant chemistry. We talked about how plant chemistry can be helpful to parasitoids by showing them where their hosts are. It can also be harmful to parasitoids if the hosts sequester these toxins and use them against parasitoids by being toxic themselves. And finally, we mentioned that ecosystem stability and ecosystem functioning is very strongly mediated and affected by the presence of parasitoids. Parasitoids are all around the world in every terrestrial ecosystem except for on Antarctica, and are probably having very important roles in natural systems and in farm systems. So with that, please feel free to ask any questions. I'm going to look back through the dialogue and pick a bunch out to answer. Thanks, guys. And before I even do that, I'm going to post some important links here if you want to use them in the dialog box. One is my Twitter handle. There are also some links to my YouTube channel. Got a little garbled up there, but let me know if you have any trouble with those. All right, let's see what questions came in. KWMS7 asked, can humans be the host of any of these parasitoids? So far, we don't know of any, although there are some human parasites like botflies that are kind of similar, but they are parasites because they don't kill their hosts. So remember that by definition, parasitoids have to kill their hosts, and luckily, humans aren't hosts for any parasitoids. The Red Schoolhouse M asked, are these larvae the same as mites? Or is this a whole new bug? I think we're talking, on the honeybees. They are different than mites, actually. They're a whole new bug. And the mites are parasites, but these flies are parasitoids. Yeah, the mites are certainly a problem in honeybee colonies. In talking about colony collapse disorder in combination with other things like pesticides. The Red Schoolhouse also asked, is this a new phenomenon or just a recent study of an old cycle? I think you're talking about the Monarch parasitoid there. So it's probably a recent study of an old cycle. There's one paper published in 1888 describing one single monarch chrysalis that was parasitized by this species. But between 1888 and the last couple of years, there were no publications in the scientific literature or any mentions that I could find outside of the scientific literature describing monarchs being attacked by this parasitoid Pteromalus cassotis. So what that tells me is not that it hasn't been happening, but that monarchs are very good at hiding as pupae. People very rarely find the pupae in the wild, and then it's even more rare that they would take the pupae from the wild, bring it into their house in a jar or something like that, and rear it to become a butterfly or to see if wasps come out. So it's just really rare. Monarchs are good at hiding, but I think it's been happening for many thousands or millions of years. What is the name of the superfamily? Good question. The name is Ichneumonidae. I'll spell it down here. Ichneumonidae. I think that's right. You'll get it if you Google it. It'll be close enough. Another question from Dory. Do any of the host species have a chemical camouflage? For instance, can they suppress the plant they are on from secreting the help chemical so the parasitoids can't find them? That is an awesome question. And honestly, I don't know if that's been found yet. There's a lot of research on the chemical ecology of plants, herbivores, and parasitoids that attack them. And you would imagine that if it's really important, that if it has a big effect on the host, the herbivore host, they would evolve to do something like mask that signal. But plants are also being selected on to continue to send that signal. So they're sort of in an arms race to make sure that the signal is sent from the plant's perspective or the signal is masked from the herbivore's perspective. And I'm not sure what the results are. If you find out, let me know. That'd be very interesting. Bethany R. asked, how does the monarch pupa wiggle to try to avoid the parasitoid laying eggs? Are there still muscles or organs to change the pressure inside the pupa? Yeah, that's really amazing, isn't it? The way that the pupa can still wiggle is that essentially it's been using those muscles to wiggle its way out of the larval skin. And before the chrysalis hardens, those muscles are still intact and still functional. As the chrysalis goes along in development, the pupa goes along in development, those muscles will degrade and no longer function. But because it had just used those muscles to wiggle out of the larval skin, they're still functional and helps it to wiggle in response. One cool part of the video that I didn't show you that you can go back and check out is that the monarch larva and pupa wiggles enough to knock the parasitoids off of itself twice in the first half of that video before the wasp finds it and crawls back on. So maybe in the wild, these wiggling defenses are enough to knock the parasitoid off so that it can't find the host again, or maybe not. It's hard to say. These were done in little containers on a lab bench, so it's pretty easy for the wasp to find the host again, but maybe in the wild, those wiggling behaviors are more helpful than in the lab. Thanks for the question, Bethany. EHS2 asks, has climate change affected parasitoid populations? Certainly it has. Again, this is a research area that I'm not very familiar with, but because parasitoids live in such an interconnected ecology, they have important interactions with their hosts, and those hosts have important interactions with the plants. If climate change affects the geographic range of any of those species, it can have important implications on the others that are in that system. Also, things like extreme weather events and really hot temperatures can affect parasitoid behavior and survival and development, excuse me. One really cool example with monarchs where climate change may be important is that monarchs typically migrate to central Mexico from the eastern United States, but now that climates are changing and people have been planting different milkweeds in places that they probably shouldn't be planting these milkweeds, monarchs are staying the winter on the Gulf Coast of the United States instead of flying all the way south to Mexico. And they're also breeding in these areas. So you can get really high populations, really dense populations of monarchs in the winter where you wouldn't normally find them. And this is, typically in these really dense populations, you find very, very high rates of parasitism by this parasitoid as well as other things like protozoan diseases. So climate change can affect monarchs in that way, as well as maybe these parasitoids. So the Pteromalus cassotis is found along much of the Gulf Coast too. Have these parasitoids been known to infest home beehives? I'm not sure about that. Typically, what happens with the zombies, as they're called, is that the flies attack them when the bees are out foraging. So if the bee is out foraging and gets attacked and the parasitoid is developing inside, it's not really a threat to the rest of the colony. And because the bees often stay out of the colony when you'd expect them to be in the colony if they have parasitoids inside, it could be that either the parasitoids are keeping the bee out of the hive for their own benefit, or the bees are keeping themselves out of the hive for the benefit of their sisters. Or maybe both. Maybe both think it's best if the bee stays out of the hive if it's infected. But in terms of the home beehives being infected, I think it's more of an individual happening on an individual basis than a hive or a colony basis. One more question from KWMS7. Do parasitoids attack other wasps? Yeah, a lot of them do. In fact, that one that was drilling through the wood, the bark of the tree, was searching for a grub of another wasp. Those wasps are not parasitoids. They're called wood-boring wasps. But then there are also a lot of hyperparasitoids that are wasps that attack other parasitoid wasps. So yeah, it can get to be like the movie Inception at some point when you think about all the hyperparasitoids attacking each other. Great questions, guys. This has been a lot of fun. Well, if there are no more questions, I just want to wrap up by saying that parasitoids can seem very gross at a first glance. They might be sort of a wow or a yuck factor, but I hope I've also shown you that they can be very elegant, very clever, and worth understanding and worth studying. So thanks for your attention. If there aren't any more questions, have a great rest of your day.